Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Leap. I have another special guest with me here this week, and her name is Brittany Anderson, and she is a partner and president of Sweet Financials. And she also has a special focus on women with children. And we will be having lots of links in the show notes for those of you who may be interested to look more deeply into what Brittany is up to. So I am now going to just ask you, Brittany, to share with our listeners, just to open up the conversation about who you have lost in your life and who we'll be talking about today.
Yeah, so I've had a couple of great losses in my life. One being my sister, who she was the baby of the family, passed away at 17 years old. She had cystic fibrosis, and even though she battled a lifetime of illness, she had been doing pretty good at the time of her passing. So even though we knew that she maybe had a little bit earlier time period on her life than others, we didn't expect that to come as early as it did. And then the second person was the loss of my father less than 18 months after that. So those two combined it was a lot. It was a lot to deal with.
It was a lot to deal with. And this was back in 2017, 2018, correct?
Yeah. So, it would have been end of 2016 and then very beginning of 2018. Yep.
Okay. So Brittany and I had an opportunity to have a conversation before we started recording. And so I'm going to lead us into that story. One thing that you talked about, Brittany, and we know can have a tremendous impact on our grief and loss journey, is the relationship that we have with the people that have passed. And just to sort of bring people up to speed, your parents had divorced when you were little. Your father remarried and had your sister. And what is your sister's name? The one who passed from cystic fibrosis?
Cheyenne.
Cheyenne. And you also had a very strained relationship with your father. So let's start there. This sort of departure with your dad, because that I know that there was a gap because of the strained relationship with your father, that you had a gap with communication with your sister who passed. So why don't you talk to us a little bit about those dynamics prior to your sister's death, because I think it really is critical to the story.
Yeah. It's one of those things where you get to a point in your life and you kind of have to protect your peace and make some really tough decisions around that. And for me, my relationship with my dad, I was a daddy's girl growing up and maybe didn't realize completely really what was going on with my dad and some of his own struggles with honesty and just different choices that he had made for his life. So as an adult, and I was looking at, having my own family and kind of creating my own legacy, I made some decisions that I just couldn't have him be part of my life. As much as it killed me, I had to do that for myself and for my future. Because of that, he very much limited communication with my siblings at the time, them being younger. So when my sister passed away, we actually hadn't spoke for, it was probably 2 or 3 years leading up to that because of that strained relationship with my dad. So when I got that phone call, it took my breath away.
Yes. And I know you're getting a little bit emotional, and that's okay. So whenever you need to take a moment and breathe, it's fine.
Whew.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, no matter how much time goes on, grief still hurts.
It does. And, I'll probably start crying with you because that's what happens to me too. It's why I do this work. It's why I do this podcast, because there's always more work to do with our grief. And sometimes when it's complex grief, right? Because you kept hoping, this is your father, you kept hoping that things would change, that eventually you would have this relationship with your dad, and it's strained. You create the boundary around that relationship. And now you don't talk to your sister 2 years before her death.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big deal. Because your sister also, I think you said it was sudden. You weren't expecting her to die. So if you're ready, let's talk about your sister. And
Yep.
So you didn't talk to her for 2 years, right?
Yeah. Yep. There was times that I would still reach out and try to, I'd send a little card here and there, or, the holidays would roll around and I always tried to let her know that I was thinking about her. So that was something that was really important to me, was that, there's a lot of things at the time that were outside of my control, but there was also a lot of things that I felt like I could still control and I could still at least make some sort of small effort. So, there's that question mark in my head. I don't know if any of those things ever got to her. And I just have come to the, I guess, realization, or come to my own peace again, that that's okay. Like if it didn't get to her and she didn't know, I think that when somebody passes, it's kind of that you have to make a decision. And this falls back on my own faith too, that, when they do kind of put their body to rest, that their souls kind of know. And that's a chance for, I guess, me to put a little bit of closure to that, I guess, situation. Yeah. And know that it's like I said, it's like we were starting to talk a little bit about this before, Susan. And I think when they're still alive and they're still here with us. I think about this from my dad and from my sister too, that there is always that hope that even though things are tarnished right now and things aren't good and things are not ideal, that maybe someday in the future they will be. And with their passing, when you realize like that date in the future isn't coming, you have to, again, kind of decide, okay, how do I move forward and through this? How do I have this become part of my life and part of my growth? Because if you don't make that decision, I feel like it destroys you. So those are some of the big decisions that I guess I've had to make for myself coming through this, is how can I help this work for me? Sean Stevenson, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He was the 3-foot giant. I had the great pleasure of, actually, I was coached by him personally one-on-one. Actually, it was the summer that he passed away. But he had this whole thing. And actually, this is one of the last things he said on his deathbed, was that life happens for you and not to you. Mm-hmm. And I think that goes hand in hand with loss, and with great loss, is you have to decide, how does this work for you? It doesn't make it easy. It doesn't make it fun. It doesn't make it any less painful, but it does help you get through it and see the other side.
And I think it's also, I say this a lot about trauma, that trauma isn't something that happens to us, but it's what happens inside of us. What happens inside of us and what we do with what happens is that grief journey, right? And so I always say, you can't run from it. You can try. We can distract ourselves. We can get stuck in our anger. We can get stuck in depression. But that is a manifestation, right, of things that are happening inside of us if we don't do something with it in some way. And so I just want to pause. I want to go back to, because I feel like this is such a critical point. So you don't have a relationship with your sister because of what's going on with your father. And I'm sure listeners are wondering, as I am, did he forbid you to have deeper contact with your sister? Was he monitoring that? Like, what I'm trying to understand is how your relationship with your dad had such a profound impact on your ability to have a relationship with your sister.
Yeah. So she was obviously very young. She died very young. So she was still living in his house. And unfortunately, with how he operated, he very much convinced her that I was essentially the enemy. And that if I wasn't going to talk to him, then basically nobody deserved my time or attention. And with how he ran his household, he would have made her life really difficult if she would have had that relationship. So again, there's a lot of, I guess, negative influence that happened there, and some denial too from the people in that household. My dad, just, I guess, point blank, he had narcissistic tendencies, and that can be really, really dangerous for people around them that don't put that distance or don't kind of realize what's going on. And unfortunately, that's really what, my family and still to this day, some of them kind of succumb to. And again, it's one of those things where I reflect back on it. And at the time I was really angry. I was really, really mad at him. And I even tried, after her funeral, I tried to just kind of open that door, because I thought, my gosh, I have another half sister and I have a full brother, and I don't want this to happen again, because this really sucked. I don't know how else to say it, but it really sucked. And it was so painful. I tried letting him back in for a little bit, and I just saw some repeat patterns. And I just basically had to say, you know what, like, I don't hate him, and I don't even have anger towards him. Like, I felt bad for him, and I felt sad for him in that life. And I think his passing, it's like, to that day, I felt sad for him and I felt bad for him. And I felt bad for me too, selfishly, that I wouldn't have that rekindled relationship. So, it's one of those things where you can only do so much. But when people are living under those circumstances after time, in order to kind of get through it and grieve past it, you kind of have to realize that they don't always even know what they're subjected to. So that's really why is he basically just put that divide between the two of us, turned her to think that I was not a good person. And that's really how that relationship fizzled.
And that's deep healing, right? Because there's two pieces here. One is your sibling relationship, and she was
Yeah.
14 years younger, and that was a very special relationship for you when you both were younger. For you to take care of yourself, one of the most difficult things that we can do as human beings is put. I think that boundaries are so challenging for most of us anyway, right?
Oh gosh,
I mean,
yeah.
whether it's boundaries around friendships or partnerships or whatever. But then when you put your parents into the mix, and even if we know that our relationship with anyone in our family is not good for us, for our mental health, it's still our family. So it's always an ongoing battle and challenge, because of course we all want a relationship with our parents and our siblings, unless we can't have one because they're abusive, right?
Right.
So when they're abusive and we have to make those sacrifices for our own mental health, as what happened with you, there was these other additional consequences, because now it also impacted a relationship with your sister that you love deeply. So now your sister dies and you are dealing with this incredible pain of losing a sister that you have been robbed of a relationship, essentially. And now you open the door to your father again, hoping that something, because of this tragedy, right? Because tragedy definitely brings us together, and we're
Absolutely.
sad and we're mourning and we're doing the things and we feel super vulnerable and we're like, wow. And in that deep vulnerability, and our hearts are blown wide open, that we think, wow, maybe this is going to create the opening for something new to blossom, right?
Yeah.
And you find out that that is not true, because your father essentially has not changed.
Right.
You
Right.
close that door. Now your father passes. Talk to us about first these two very different losses, both
Yeah.
very profound. Brittany, what did you do with this double tragedy? I know that you were working with a coach.
Mm-hmm.
I want to hear about your grief journey.
Yeah. It was the feelings and the experiences really were so different and are so different to this day. With my sister, it's like this innocent life, right? Like this innocent young person who had so much opportunity and possibility ahead of her, knowing that she, lost out on that chance. That was really hard. And for me, it was like, that was a relationship that I had craved and yearned for. And to know that you're not going to have that. She's in a different place, and, her physical being isn't here anymore. So that journey it was honestly really hard. And it took me quite a bit of time. And actually, it's interesting. My oldest daughter, even though, I share a different mom than what my sister did, my oldest daughter has kind of an eerie resemblance in a lot of ways to my sister. And
Let me stop recording. We'll take a breath.
yeah, just for a second.
So we're back. And what we were talking about was how you see so much of your sister in your daughter.
Yeah.
And Brittany, I can just tell from the time that we've talked that you are this incredibly strong woman, and you've had to draw some pretty hard lines in the sand, which is, as we've already talked about, is incredibly painful. What have you done with this sadness? And
Yeah.
just talk to us about what that has looked like for you.
Yeah, I think a couple things. It's really helped me. Actually, Matthew McConaughey, he was doing a talk at his book launch, or one of his book launches, Green Lights is what he wrote. And he was talking about how, it's really a lot simpler to decide what you do want in life when you say what you don't want. And, I reflect back and I look at, my dad and some of his own flaws. I look at my sister and that flawed relationship that I had. And, for me, I just decided, I was like, you know what? I'm going to take the good and I'm going to make that part of my life. So my dad, one great thing about him, he was very charming and very charismatic. Like if you met him on the street, you would think that he is just the best. And so I said, you know what? I'm going to use that for good because I feel like I do have some of that in me. So I'm going to use that for good. And I'm going to help inspire people in a way that helps them have even better lives. And in turn, for me, when I see that impact, it helps me have an even better life. And it helps me kind of put peace to maybe some of the negative stuff that happened in my relationship with my father. I think it's helped me to be a better leader, learning that you can forgive and you can move past the tough stuff while also holding firm boundaries to protect your own value system. I look at these losses and it's really helped me shape, what I stand for, what I don't stand for, and how I can show up for my kids, maybe in a way that neither of my parents could when I was younger, not because they were incapable or even bad parents per se. It just means that I have things that I want to do even better. And again, I'm going to choose to go the good route versus, falling into the trap of the victim mindset or the negativity that could absolutely unwind from kind of thinking again of life happening to you versus for you. I'm going to choose to look at it in reverse. So it really has shaped, who I allow in my life and what I focus on and how I show up as a person.
I think that that's amazing because I think that our parents are flawed just as we are flawed. Every human being is flawed. And, as children, we don't want our parents to be flawed, right? We look at them as sort of the end all be all. And then when we realize they're human beings, it's sort of kind of shocking, when we're disillusioned, we're like, oh my God, my father actually doesn't know everything. I remember used to thinking that my father knew everything. And I think also, they also help us, as you said, they help us shape who we become, whether that we become like them or we choose to become not like them or pick and choose how we want to be like them, et cetera. And sometimes it's very subconscious and it plays out and manifests in ways because it's just in our DNA. And so I'm curious though, I always talk about grief being, it's messy. There is nothing tidy about the emotions of grief and the anger that can come up or the guilt that can come up or all of the other things that can be part of that cocktail of grief. Even though it might look a little different from person to person, it's so universal when we really feel like we're in this just pit of yuck.
Yeah.
And so I'm just, what's some of the work? I mean, I love that you've had these influences. What did the work look like for you during the messy times,
Yeah. For me, it's been a saving grace just having really good people around me. And I'm such a fiercely independent person. Like ever since I was a kid, I think back and I was real young and I was sitting there thinking of ways that I could make money in order to support myself in the future. And this is way before times that kids should ever be thinking that way. Most of the time you're saving up for a cool toy or something like that. Not me. I wanted to save for my future. So, I have this tendency when things get tough to try to just solve it on my own. And through the messy stuff and the hard times, I really had to lean on the people that were closest to me and that I knew wouldn't let me wallow either, that would really help me kind of regain my focus and shift out of that time of whether it be anger or frustration or sadness or guilt or whatever around everything, people who would kind of help me keep perspective. So I think that's really number one. Number two, I am a huge absorber of all things positive. I don't know how else to say that, but I also leaned a lot on, just different inspirations, even if it was something as simple as, Googling positive quotes. But I literally would do that in times where I was having a really rough day. I'm like, I don't have time to read a whole book today. I don't have time to dive into a bunch of chapters, but I can read a couple of quick uplifting things that can maybe just help shape my mindset. So it sounds so simple and kind of silly, but it absolutely helped me to get out of those tough times. And, even today, it's kind of like we talked about, like, there's no timeline on grief, and you don't like, there's not a day where you just wake up and you're like, oh, I'm never going to be sad again. It just doesn't happen like that. Like, there's these trigger points in life, and there's these moments, at least for me, where all of a sudden I'm like, why am I so sad? Or why is my sister so heavy on my heart today? Or, why am I thinking about my dad so much right now? Like, where's this coming from? And it's grief. And it's this like roller coaster that you're on that you'll never get off of, but it'll be, I guess, for me, less bumpy as time goes.
I just have to say this because I'm thinking it.
Yeah, please do.
Everyone knows I have no filter. So you're very driven, right? And,
Yeah.
and that is just true from your career too. You're a partner in this, in your company, and you're president. And I have a dear friend. You remind me of her, as a matter of fact, because she's also one who, I don't know how else to say it except that she really doesn't let herself be sad. And I'm not saying that you don't, but you remind me where you're like, okay, if I'm sad, I need to like snap right out of that. And so it was just timing wise, it's interesting because she and I had a very long conversation about this because her mother's aging, and, she started to get concerned that her mother's going to die, and it's anticipatory grief, right? Like her mother's 91 years old. And so when your mom is that age, that the time is near. I mean, obviously we never know, but when you get to a point in life, it is actually coming.
Yeah.
And, so we really talked about that, because one thing that we know, and this is, I would love for you to speak about this, because I'm just the opposite. I want to cry. I'll sit there with my little bag of popcorn and I'll be like, I'm just going to sit here and cry today. And I'm going to give myself this whole day to bawl my eyes out and get into my pajamas and eat ice cream if I want. And, but for you, it sounds like, please correct me if I'm wrong, that you're more like my girlfriend, where if you're starting to feel sad, you're like, okay, let's take 2 minutes to do this thing that we're doing. And now let's move on. And I really want you to talk to us about this, because we're all so different. Does that sound like that describes you?
Yeah, it's actually funny because I think that's who I've evolved to be, because I absolutely used to have more of that tendency to need to like sit in it and be sad for a long period of time. And I think honestly, a lot of what's happened in my life, like my life for the past how many years, I have 3 little kids, pretty darn close in age. And, our company has been growing and booming. And I have a couple other companies that I am involved with and have ownership in. And it's just been like, fast paced. I'm like laughing to myself as you're talking about this, going, you are absolutely dead on. Like, I don't give myself these days, like even 5 minutes. It's like, okay, I am a crier. I will say, like, a lot of my emotion comes out my eyes. So if I'm happy, I tend to get tears. If I'm sad, I get tears. If I'm mad, I get tears, but it's very short lived. And it's like, okay, on to the next thing. So yes, you are so right. And, again, I don't think there's like a right or wrong way to handle it. It's just, we all handle it so different. And honestly, I could I could learn from you, who you do let yourself be sad. And there's probably some merit to that, where you just kind of like get it all out and you take that time and that space that you need. And, then you're probably able to pick up and move on past that. Whereas I very much I'll only allow kind of a certain period of time. And then I'll just say, all right, it's time to refocus. I got stuff to do. I got, kids to show up for. I got, whatever, we got house projects and remodeling and everything else going on all at the same time. So I do just tend to maybe leap past it a little too fast sometimes.
I love that you use LEAP, because that's the name of the podcast. I love that you said that, because, the acronym for LEAP is to listen, engage, allow the feelings to come into process. And is there a right or wrong way? Absolutely not. Everybody is different. But I noticed it even when you started to cry, how quickly you wanted to pull back. And the reason I'm bringing this up and reflecting is because you're a busy human being. And so many of us are so busy all the time, but you got 3 small children, you've got a full-on career, and I'm imagining a partner. And so you've got all of these things that you're trying to juggle. And I think that is so true for women anyway, where we say, oh, when do we have time to even take 2 seconds to do anything? Self-care. And I think that why I'm so passionate about grief and loss work is that it is such deep self-care, to be able to take that time, but it's uncomfortable. And, and a lot of people will say to me, well, Susan, I don't want to sit there and cry. I've got to show up for my children. I don't want to sit there and cry and do the thing, because a lot of people are terrified too, that if they start to cry, they are not going to be able to pull it back and do the things they need to do. And so, yes, there is absolutely 100% no right way to do it. But I'm saying this to listeners. I don't know if you guys can see that are watching video, but my little, this is my little miniature Aussie doodle who's jumping up on me.
Cutest thing ever.
Yeah, he's the cutest thing. He wants to get some love. His name is Rocky. My brother who died was Rocky, and the breeder had named him. The breeder actually had named him Rocky, which is why I bought him. Yeah, and it shares my brother's birthday. It was like meant to be. What? Anyway, I know it was crazy.
That's incredible. Oh my goodness, I just got chills.
My 14-and-a-half-year-old golden retriever died the day before my birthday. And I bought this dog on New Year's Day. I didn't get him for, a month later, but it was just meant to be. Wow. Anyways, I derail, but going back to what we were saying. And so I want listeners to hear this, because grief work is so extraordinarily painful, but it also moves a lot. It moves so much pain through our body when we do allow it to come. But your way is to say, okay, I'm going to let this come, right? You cried a little bit today. I'm going to let it come. So you're not shoving it away. You allow it to come. You just don't allow it to linger. Right? I mean, that's what it sounds like.
Yeah. And I think I'm very much one of those people that I love doing like introspective work, like understanding like, well, why am I that way? Or why do I behave that way? Or why do I make decisions that way? And I think I've actually had these conversations with my husband before about, my mom growing up, she battled depression, and, it was one of those things where there'd be a couple days there where she couldn't get out of bed. And as an adult now, I look back at that and I'm like, oh my gosh, like that was a real thing that she battles and still battles today. And, for me, I think some of that of like not allowing myself is because as a kid, I would get frustrated and I'd be like, well, why can't she get out of bed? Like, I want her to play. I want her to come do this. I want to go do something. And I think some of that is, it stems from that a little bit. But again, listening to you and hearing you talk about that grieving process, I think she had her own grief that she was going through, different things in life, which is a whole different conversation. But, she was one that had to process in a different way and had to kind of let it all out of her system in those big chunks of time. And I think it does shape a little bit of my speediness on to the next. But I will say that I'll say it like this. I don't feel that I'm one of those people that doesn't allow things to process at all and that wants to ignore it. I definitely don't love sitting in it because it doesn't make me feel good. And I like things that make me feel good. So I do try to find some sort of silver lining. And even with all of this, I mean, I could have gone a couple very different directions and been, really sad and gotten into kind of a dark place with what happened with my sister and my dad. And I think it would have been probably justified from the outside looking in. And for me, it was just like, you know what, bad things happen and bad things happen to good people. And you know what, I can either have this kind of destroy what I'm working towards, or I can have it work for me. And that's where my mind goes. And that's, I think, what helps me kind of pull that grief full circle and gets through it by putting it to work.
I just think that is so beautifully put. And because like I said, everybody does what is comfortable for them in their own way and in their own time. And that is just my deepest belief. I have talked to, at this point, I can't count the number of conversations I've had around grief and loss between clients and group work, all the people I interviewed for my book, and of course, the people that I get the deep honor of interviewing for the podcast. And I love to hear the different perspectives. I think it's so important for listeners too, to understand there is no right way. But what I always like to drive home is just allow a way, just allow a way for you to be able to process and feel that loss, because, you do weave it into your life in some way. I think it is such a haunting image of you as a child dealing with a mother who had depression and laying in bed, right? Because I can imagine that little 4 or 5-year-old little Brittany looking at her mom and making a promise that I'm going to be happy when I grow up, right? I mean, these are the things that we do with our parents. We make these promises of what we're going to do or what we're not going to do based on what we see. And some of that, like I said, it's in our subconscious and we're not even aware of it until something happens that sort of brings it to the forefront for us to have this opportunity to look at. And
Yeah.
so I want to ask you now, so your sister and dad have been gone now for 3, 4 years, right?
Yeah. Dad would be about 4 years and sister would be just over around 5.5. Yeah. Mhm.
And so, I think I use it all the time that gifts always come from tragedy. People don't often think of tragedy bringing a gift, but I believe in universal balance. Something bad happens, something good has to follow. And for many of us, we can't see that good for a long time after a death. And
Yeah.
for some people, never. They never see a gift. So I want to ask you, you know, in hindsight, what beauty has bloomed in the space that these people in your life have left behind?
Mm, yeah. I think of a couple of things and I love your thought process with that because I think you're so right. I think there are gifts from tragedy and there's gifts from trauma too. I mean, you could put that in a few different settings. There's a couple things that come to mind. So, number one, I think about my own feelings around kind of what happened. And especially after my dad died, I remember my sister's funeral in particular. Like, I think I cried for like 10 hours straight, like her funeral, and it was super long. It was like a celebration of life, and it was like all day long. And I don't think the tears stopped one time, but it was almost like I got so much of it out then. And then with my dad, I did go out to his funeral too. And I had these moments or these days though that I would just be, it was like it would hit me and I would just, be super upset or I'd be sad or I'd just be kind of like in a funk. And, I think just the whole experience all the way around has made me so much more even empathetic to where people are at and to what they're experiencing. For me, it's like I am a very driven human being and I put on that brave face every day and I show up for my team. And that's important to me. Like it's important to me to be a leader in that way. But you just don't know what's going on behind closed doors and you don't know what people are battling and what they're dealing with. And, I think about even my kids now, like my oldest, my 8-year-old. There's been a couple times where she's hitting what I feel is kind of the preteen girl stage at a very early age. And she'll get a little emotional and like worked up over certain things. And I'll just tell her, like, how you feel is so relevant and it's so true. And it's how you feel right now. And I think that, when it comes back to grief, like that's a gift. I think after you've gone through it, if you go through the work and you kind of get through that initial grieving stage, for me, that feels like the biggest gift is just total empathy over how people handle things, not just death, but just life in general and the hard stuff. So I would say that's a really big one, is just that kind of increase in empathy for how people are feeling, how they're handling things, how they cope with things, how they navigate life. Like that's been huge. And the other thing too is, I think people spend, and I've been guilty of this, an exhaustive amount of time on, wishing that you could change things in other people, or wishing that people were a different way, or even finding fault in everybody else and maybe not looking at yourself. And, I look at what happened with my sister and my dad, and I went through that wave of emotion of, oh my gosh, what if, and, if I would have done something different, what would that have looked like? And I think coming out of it, you're able to kind of see some of the good that you were too blind to see maybe at the time. So I think about like what I talked about with my dad a little bit ago about seeing that, he was charismatic and he did have this kind of gregarious personality about him. It doesn't take away from the fact of the hurt that he did cause in my life. But at the same time, if I would have maybe looked at that characteristic and seen that in him at the time, I think I still would have kept my distance and I would have created those boundaries, but I wouldn't have held so much anger and frustration and resentment. So I think those are two gifts. It's like, not everybody is bad. They make bad choices sometimes, they do bad things, but they're not bad. And then just understanding where people are at. Those are two things that I feel like have enhanced in my life since those things happened.
Wow. Thank you for that. I love what you're saying. I mean, it is so easy to categorize people and put them into boxes.
Mhm.
And we are not all one thing. We are multi-dimensional people. And as I said earlier, our parents are human beings and they're flawed. And
Mhm.
when we are able to really create the grace of being human and being flawed, I think it is much easier for us to let go of anger that we may have toward our parents for something they did do, for something they didn't do, for something we think they should have done. Because, of course, our parents are as close to the divine as we can get, right? I mean, they're our parents. They raise us, they shape us. And when we have those feelings of anger, and for some people, deep hatred toward their parents, who it affects is us, and I'm working on a course I'm going to be putting out on really how do we heal our anger because it can debilitate us, and how do we forgive unforgivable acts, because people, I think, look at forgiveness as though it's condoning behavior. And that, of course, is not what it's about. Forgiveness really is for us, not the person who has caused us harm. And that's that compassion and that love is what helps us to heal and become more loving and compassionate toward ourselves. Because when we can forgive those flaws in other human beings, we then can embrace all of who we are. And we all have a shadow side. And so, if we could have more grace for our humanness, I think that we would have a more compassionate, loving world. And, we always say, peace starts with us. What does that mean?
Yeah.
But it's true. Peace does start with us, because if we don't have internal peace, which only comes from acceptance of self, right? Then we can't extend that grace to other people.
Yeah. I want to comment there too that, one of the quotes that I've seen that has always resonated is it's something along the lines of holding a grudge is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. And it's so true. I mean, and I think too, if you want to, I guess you could look at this as a gift or just perspective. I think this is more perspective in general. I shared with you as we were kind of starting our initial conversation that, for me, something that actually helped me get outside of maybe my own, not feelings, because I do feel like I allowed myself to feel through it, but taking perspective from like my stepmom, for example. She lost her daughter, her only like true blood child, and her husband in less than 18 months. I look at my grandmother. She lost her grandchild and she lost her son in less than 18 months. And I will say this across the board that I don't think, losing a child is not something you wish on anybody. It's like unnatural. It goes against like the natural progression of life, whatever that means or looks like. And for me, that really actually helped a lot with my healing, is being able to kind of look at it from their eyes and say, you know what? Yes, this is my grief. And yes, I am in it and I'm feeling it too. But at the same time, honoring where they were at and seeing that pain through somebody else's eyes, it helped me kind of get through the whole entire chain of events a little bit easier. Is just, again, maybe it's that empathy thing, being able to just kind of see where they were at and what they were experiencing.
And looking through the eyes of somebody else can lend so much more perspective to our own journey and our own pain. And you made me think of some experiences I had at the Center for Grieving Children when I was running groups, and some of the multiple losses that people sustained. And I didn't understand how people could go on. And, I heard in this podcast one day, it was so beautiful what this guest had said, but he said, sometimes it's not healing. Sometimes it's just being able to carry the really hard stuff. And and I love that because it puts it into so much perspective. I mean, the resilience of the human spirit is so profound to me. And we are way stronger than any of us could ever imagine. And the saying, that what doesn't kill us makes us stronger, but nothing makes us stronger. We have that strength. We just don't see it until something happens where we have to show up with this Herculean strength. And I think it's the most incredible thing about being alive. I think it's the most painful thing about being alive, right? Mm-hmm. It's that sometimes the big accomplishment is just carrying the really hard thing. I have one more question that I always ask at the end of my interviews, and then we will have you give your channels of where people can find you. But I always ask the question, of course, this is a podcast of grief and loss, but what self-love looks like for you now. What does that mean to you?
Yeah. Self-love, it really goes back to creating a system of values. And this is something that has honestly helped me embrace the idea of self-love, because again, you're a driven person and you're kind of living for everybody else around you. It can be hard. Like self-care, you just kind of laugh at it a little bit. Like, what's that? But self-love for me is establishing values and really living by those and trying to lean into and practice them every day. It's being in congruency with what I say is important to me and what I look at and that I want and need for my life, and really embracing that and not going outside of that. So it's staying true to who I am and what I believe in and the people that I value. That to me is self-love.
Thank you, Brittany. Is there anything else you'd like to say to listeners before we close with where we can find you?
The biggest thing is, it's like we talked about, everybody processes grief so different. And if you're listening to this and you are in kind of the fresh beginning, as you can see from my emotion that I had throughout this whole entire call, it's just one of those things that regardless of where you're at, it's okay to be there. And that's something that I had to remind myself of all the time, was that it's okay. It's okay to feel this way. And it's okay to have those ups and downs and that roller coaster. And it never goes away, but it does become easier to deal with over time. It's not a perfect road, but it does get easier as time goes on.
Yes, it does. And, going back to what I said earlier, where, do the work in the way that feels manageable. That's probably the best way to put it, right? And it does get easier over time. And as one of my guests said, it's such a gorgeous image of how, we have this hole in our life, we have this hole in our heart, and we learn to grow our grief around it. And I think that that is really true. And I also believe that these amazing things bloom in that space that they have left behind. So, Brittany, where can people find you?
Yeah. So I can absolutely include some of my social media handles and all of that for the show notes, but easy couple ways, sweetfinancial.com. We have contact page there. To make it really easy, Brittany at sweetfinancial.com. I answer any emails. So if I can be helpful on anybody's journey, please don't hesitate to reach out, because I absolutely will respond. And then I do have one more website, brittanyanderson.com, that you can go to as well to get a hold of me. So whatever works best for you works for me.
Can you just quickly tell us too, because you said you're doing a special focus on something called More Than a Mom. Can you just speak to that for just a minute? Because it sounded so intriguing, and and so you never know, there might be a mom out there listening that this might speak to.
Yeah. So I've kind of felt a calling on my heart, because, I don't have enough on my plate. So I figured I'd add one more thing. I'm building out a platform to be able to help career focused women who have that drive, who want, something that's maybe more. They want something more in their professional life, but who also have small kids at home. A platform to really help them realize that you don't have to sacrifice one for the other. And there's this thing called a perfect imbalance that we can all achieve and help each other towards. So working on building that out, and I'll have a book coming out actually that I just sent to the editor. I'm so excited about it.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you. It's my fifth book, but probably the one that calls to my heart the most. So that'll be coming out later this year.
Oh, that is wonderful. And we have all of that in the show notes. Of course, the first thing that came up for me is I think about the moms that, that were stay-at-home moms and lost their partner. When I was running groups, there were a lot of situations like that. So
yeah.
So it just feels pertinent given what you're doing and helping these moms with their careers and whatnot. Okay. So thank you so much for being on the show today, Brittany. I really, really appreciate this beautiful conversation that we've had, and for sharing a piece of your life with us and a piece of your grief journey with us. And everybody, we will have all of Brittany's channels in the show notes, and we'll see you guys here next week. Bye for now.